The first thing was the lightness. Not in my head, though, that came a moment later, a dizzy swimming sensation like I'd stood up too fast. No, this was a physical unburdening, a fractional subtraction of mass from the world, or at least from me. I pushed the duvet aside. It seemed to float for an instant longer than it should, settling with a sigh rather than a soft thump. My own limbs, as I swung them out of bed, felt buoyant, my feet meeting the worn pine floorboards with less impact. I stood, and for a beat I thought I might drift upwards, just a centimetre or two. A pen, one of my favourite archival quality microns, lay on the bedside table. I nudged it. It rolled, then tipped off the edge. I watched it fall, and it seemed to take its time, a lazy arc instead of a direct plummet. It hit the floor with a click that was too gentle. I picked it up, tossed it a few inches into the air. It hung there, at the apex of its tiny flight, for a sliver of a second too long before returning to my palm. 10% less weight, I thought idly, if I had to put a number to the feeling. Probably just sleep deprivation. I'd been up late, cross-referencing colonial-era land grants for the Thayer Street redevelopment project. The light-headedness persisted as I went through my morning routine. Reaching for the coffee grinder on the top shelf of the kitchen cabinet, my arm extended with an ease that felt unearned. My muscles met less resistance. I frowned, shaking my head, trying to clear the cobwebs. Maybe I was coming down with something. Outside, the early May air was cool, typical for Providence. I lived on a narrow street off Benefit, a lane of tightly packed clapboard houses, mostly dating back to the 18th and 19th centuries. The brick wall of the carriage house across the alley, usually a familiar patchwork of weathered reds and browns, looked altered. Patches of it, irregular and stark, were now a burnished, cold-looking steel. Not paint, not cladding. The steel was part of the brick, as if some sections had transmuted, the mortar lines still visible but now framing metallic plates that seemed to drink the morning light rather than reflect it. The lamppost at the corner, one of those faux gaslight things the Historical Society insisted on, was different too. It was taller, sleeker, its familiar fluted design replaced by a severe, unadorned cylinder of the same dark, matte metal as the patches on the wall. The light it cast, which should have been a warm yellow, was a pale, sharp blue, and I could feel a resonance from it, a low thrum that vibrated in my teeth when I got close. At the Daily Grind, my usual coffee spot, the chipped ceramic mugs were gone. In their place were heavy, angular vessels of dark, metallic-looking material. They were cool to the touch, the edges uncomfortably sharp against my palm. The barista, a young woman named Chloe, whose elaborate latte art I usually admired, gave me a blank look when I asked for the usual. "Name?" she asked, her voice flat, her eyes not quite meeting mine. I told her, and my medium drip with a splash of oat milk eventually arrived in one of the new, vaguely brutalist cups. It tasted the same, at least. But the small disruption, the break in routine, sat like a stone in my gut, adding to the morning's subtle discord. Work at the city planning archive in the basement of the municipal building only deepened the strangeness. I pulled the original plat maps for the Weybosset Street Historic District, the ones I'd personally handled and catalogued not 6 months ago. The paper felt stiffer than I remembered, the surface too smooth, almost synthetic. Not the familiar, slightly brittle parchment of the 19th century originals, nor the crisp linen rag paper of the early 20th century copies. This was thin, almost like a plastic film, slick under my fingers. The ink was too perfect, the lines of the colonial-era script unnervingly sharp, lacking the feathering and fading. And then I saw where the First Baptist Church should have been, a grand colonial edifice. The blueprint showed a stark, windowless block labelled in tiny, precise lettering, Resource Processing Unit 4. The surrounding street names were correct, the lot lines familiar, but the landmark was erased, replaced by something alien. My breath caught. I flipped to another map, one I knew intimately, the layout of College Hill. Familiar streets, yes, but the dormitories of Brown University were rendered as severe, multi-level structures described as habitation quadrants A through F. I checked the accession numbers, the catalogue entries. All matched my records. I logged into the digital archive system, my fingers fumbling on the keyboard. I searched for a small, recently designated historic landmark, a cooperage down by the old harbour I'd surveyed myself last fall. The entry loaded, Lot 117 India Point Industrial Zone. The designation beneath it read, Zone 7 Habitation Unit Organic Containment Pending. No update history in the metadata, no record of revision. It was as if these changes had always been. A sharp scent, like ozone after a thunderstorm but with an undercurrent of hot metal, seemed to cling to the air in the archive, a smell I couldn't quite place or dismiss. When I went to the small, grimy window that looked out onto a service alley, the usual city sounds, the rumble of buses, distant sirens, snippets of conversation, were overlaid with something else, a higher-pitched whine to the traffic, and somewhere, not far, a rhythmic metallic clanking, like a giant methodical blacksmith at work. It was regular, yet unplaceable. "Sarah," I said, my voice a little too loud. My colleague looked up from her monitor, a frown creasing her brow. "Look at this." I spread the Weybosset Street map on her desk. "The First Baptist Church, it's gone, replaced by this resource processing unit." She leaned over, her eyes scanning the blueprint. She tapped the unfamiliar structure. "What about it? Looks like the standard zoning designation for industrial reclamation. Did they finally approve the waterfront redevelopment?" "No, Sarah, this is the historic map. This church has been there since 1775. This thing isn't real." She looked at me then, a genuine puzzlement in her eyes mixed with a hint of concern. "Alex, are you feeling okay? That's the old consolidated power plant, isn't it? Been derelict for years. They're probably just updating the zoning for demolition." Consolidated power? That was miles away on the other side of the river. This map was clearly labelled Weybosset Street. I pointed to the street names, my finger trembling slightly. "But it says..." She patted my arm. "Maybe you need a break. Too many late nights with those dusty old things." She turned back to her screen, the dismissal gentle but absolute. I retreated to my desk, the plastic-feeling map under my hands. Was I losing my mind? Stress? Hallucination? The lightness I'd felt all morning, the metallic tang in the air, Sarah's utter incomprehension, it all coalesced into a suffocating knot of doubt. I stayed late, driven by a frantic need to understand. I pulled more maps, cross-referenced digital records, my paranoia growing with every anomaly, every file that showed a world different from the one I knew. The sun began to set, the archive sinking into deep shadow, lit only by the pale illumination from my monitor. The rhythmic clanking from outside seemed louder now. I must have dozed off, slumped over a stack of altered zoning ordinances, because I woke with a start to a low, resonant vibration. It wasn't just in the floorboards this time. It was in the air, in my bones, a deep thrum that made the fillings in my molars ache. The overhead utility lights, caged in their metal guards, didn't just dim. They wavered, their color changing from a dirty yellow to a harsh white and back again, accompanied by a crackling sound like dry leaves burning. My eyes fixed on the tall, oak bookshelf against the far wall, crammed with city council records dating back to the early 20th century. As I watched, its familiar dark wood began to shimmer. Not like heat haze, but like its very substance was losing cohesion, its outline blurring, resolving, then blurring again. The deep brown lightened, the grain vanished. The solid carved oak seemed to flow and reform, solidifying into stark metallic shelving units of the same burnished, unadorned steel I'd seen in the alley wall that morning. The rows of leather-bound ledgers and cardboard document boxes dissolved, their forms wavering like smoke, then snapping into new shapes, ranks of identical thin grey data slates, each precisely aligned, and the gravity. For a moment, it felt as if a great weight pressed down on me, forcing the air from my lungs, pinning me to my chair. Then, just as suddenly, it lessened, that 10% buoyancy returning with a rush that made my head spin. I stared at the transformed bookshelf. The process had taken perhaps 30 seconds. The last vestiges of the old oak were gone, replaced by hard alien geometry. The first pale light of dawn was seeping through the grimy window. Another day. Numbly, I walked to the small, rarely used staff bathroom. There was an old spring-loaded scale in the corner. I stepped onto it. The needle wobbled, then settled. 152 pounds. I always weighed 167, 15 pounds. A measurable, undeniable difference. This wasn't stress. This wasn't a dream. My world was being rewritten, layer by layer, and I was, it seemed, the only one holding the original manuscript. The next few days dissolved into furtive observation. My archivist's training, honed over years of sifting through fragile documents and deciphering faded script, found a new purpose. I started a journal, not a digital one. I no longer trusted my laptop, but an old-fashioned, thread-bound ledger I'd salvaged from a box of discarded office supplies. In it, I meticulously recorded every anomaly. The time, always just before or during dawn, the precise nature of the transformation, the accompanying sensory phenomena, the gravitational tugs, the metallic scent that now seemed to permanently coat the back of my throat, the specific timbre of the new thrums that emanated from corrected structures. I took photographs with an old film camera I found in my closet, a relic from a college photography class. Digital images felt too mutable, too easily altered by whatever force was at play. I sketched the juxtapositions of brick and steel, the alien angles of newly materialized architecture. Patterns began to emerge from the chaos. The corrections favored inorganic replacements. Wood became metal. Glass became some kind of opaque, obsidian-like material. Soil and plant life in small city gardens were paved over with geometrically precise, interlocking grey slabs that felt oddly warm to the touch. Older structures, those with deep historical roots, seemed more vulnerable, as if their very antiquity made them prime targets for overwriting. There was a directionality to it too, a slow creep eastward from the Providence River, like an invisible tide consuming the city block by block. The gravity fluctuations intensified during these events, a lurch that often left me nauseous and disoriented for hours. The corrections were no longer subtle. One morning, the spire of the historic Beneficent Congregational Church, a landmark on Weybosset Street that had graced the city skyline for over 200 years, was gone. In its place, or rather fused with its remaining stone base, was a colossal, windowless cube of the same dark, burnished metal I'd seen before. It rose a dozen stories, its surface unbroken by any discernible features save for rows of ventilation grills that emitted slow, rhythmic puffs of what smelled like superheated steam and sulfur. A powerful, subaudible drone emanated from it. My old hiking compass, when I dug it out and held it nearby, spun, its needle quivering like a terrified insect. The air around the structure crackled with a static charge. It wasn't just a building, it was an occupation. My smartphone became increasingly unreliable. Texts would arrive as strings of incomprehensible symbols, sharp-edged glyphs that resembled circuit diagrams more than any human language. Calls would drop, replaced by bursts of harsh static or sequences of high-pitched musical tones. Internet searches for terms like reality shifts, mass delusion providence, or buildings changing yielded either error messages or pages of corrupted data, the text dissolving into pixelated snow. One afternoon, waiting for a bus, a route that now had a different number, and a bus that looked more like an armored transport, the digital display at the shelter changed. The familiar "next bus 5 minutes" was replaced by a stark, white-on-black message in blocky sans-serif capitals. Organic presence in designated zones restricted, compliance mandatory. Below it, smaller text scrolled in precise English. Failure to comply will result in sanitation protocols. A moment later, a synthesized voice repeated the message from unseen speakers. It was the voice of a machine giving orders. I tried cautiously to talk to people, not about the grand, existential horror of it all, but about small, undeniable changes. "Did you notice they repainted the post office?" I'd ask a grocery clerk, pointing to the familiar red brick building that was now a gleaming metallic silver. It was always brick, wasn't it? They'd look at me, confusion crossing their face, then settling into placid certainty. "No, I think it's always been silver." Looks nice, doesn't it? Their memories, it seemed, were being corrected along with the physical world. I was living in a constant state of being gaslighted by reality itself. There was one person, though. An old man I sometimes saw near the bus station, Prophet Jones, the other homeless folk called him. He'd always been there, muttering about government conspiracies and chemtrails. Lately, his pronouncements had shifted. "The metal gods are waking!" he'd cry, his voice hoarse, eyes wide and frantic. "They see our rot. They're cleaning house." He gestured with a grimy hand at a newly corrected office building, its windows now dark, unreflective slits. "They build their temples on our bones." I approached him once. "What do you see?" I asked, keeping my voice low. He fixed me with an unnervingly lucid gaze. "The seams, boy. Can't you see the seams? Where their world bleeds into ours. It ain't solid. Not anymore." The next day, Prophet Jones was gone. The alcove where he slept, between a bakery, still stubbornly itself, and a corrected bookstore, now a blank-faced information node, was empty. A fresh patch of those warm grey paving slabs covered the spot. No trace remained. It was as if he'd never existed. I was watching a small park on the east side, one that had resisted correction for longer than most. At dawn, the wrought iron benches warped and reformed into angular, uncomfortable-looking metallic slabs. Then a small beetle-like drone, no bigger than my hand, descended silently from the sky. It was dull black, with 6 articulated legs. A single, crimson optical sensor, like a malevolent ruby, swept back and forth, methodically scanning the newly altered benches, the strangely inert ground. It moved without hesitation, without any of the tentative explorations of an animal. It was pure purpose. A few days later, from the window of a derelict warehouse overlooking a newly corrected industrial zone, I saw something larger, a multi-limbed maintenance bot, easily 10 feet tall. It clung to the side of what used to be a brick factory, its appendages ending in a variety of tools, one a high-energy beam that sliced through old steel girders like butter, another extruding a stream of quick-hardening metallic foam that patched holes with seamless efficiency. It moved with a tireless rhythm, rewriting the cityscape before my eyes. The personal cost arrived on a Tuesday. My next-door neighbour, Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who'd always had a kind word and a plate of cookies for me during the holidays, lived in the apartment adjacent to mine in our converted Victorian. I hadn't seen her for 2 days, which was unusual. That morning, her peeling blue door was gone. In its place was a seamless, featureless plate of the now ubiquitous dark metal, identical to the patches on the alley wall. There was no handle, no lock, no peephole. It was utterly blank. I pressed my ear to it, and through the thick metal, I could hear rhythmic mechanical sounds, a repetitive whirring and clicking, like delicate machinery endlessly assembling and disassembling something small. I knocked, then pounded, my calls of, "Mrs. Henderson?" echoing unanswered in the suddenly alien hallway. There was no response, only the persistent, quiet industry from within. Fear became a constant companion. I started sleeping in my clothes, my backpack with the journal, film camera, and a few salvaged supplies always within reach. One night, unable to bear the silence of my apartment and the unsettling sounds from Mrs. Henderson's former home, I decided to walk, to try and clear my head. I stayed out too late, wandering streets that were becoming increasingly unfamiliar. Dawn was approaching as I neared my building, then the air crackled. It was a sound I was starting to dread, a dry, electric rustle like a million tiny sparks. The street beneath my feet seemed to distort, the asphalt momentarily translucent. A wave of intense nausea hit me, and the peculiar lightness in my limbs intensified, making me stumble. I instinctively threw my arm up to shield my eyes from a sudden, strobing blue light that erupted from a nearby corrected storefront. A sharp, burning pain shot through my left forearm. It felt like being simultaneously pierced by 1,000 icy needles and seared with a hot iron. I cried out, clutching my arm, falling to my knees as the world swam around me. The sensation lasted only a few seconds, but it was agonizing. When the disorientation subsided, I looked at my arm. The sleeve of my jacket was singed. Beneath it, on my skin, was a mark. It wasn't a burn in the conventional sense, though it was red and inflamed. It was a delicate, almost beautiful grid-like pattern, like a section of a circuit board etched into my flesh, the lines a silvery grey against the angry red. It didn't bleed, but it throbbed with a dull, alien ache. Over the next few hours, the redness subsided slightly, but the silvery grid remained. It didn't look like a scar. It looked like an implant, something integral. Later that day, I saw them from my window. Not drones, not maintenance bots. These were different, tall, bipedal figures encased in dark, segmented armor that mirrored the aesthetic of the corrected buildings. They moved with a heavy, implacable tread down the newly metalled surface of what used to be Hope Street, their optical sensors glowing with the same crimson light as the drones. Each carried a weapon, or what looked like one, a cylindrical device that occasionally emitted a brief, targeted beam of disruptive energy at anything that looked out of place. A loose paving stone from the old world, a stubborn patch of weeds. They weren't just changing the city. They were occupying it, and the mark on my arm was a terrifying new kind of receipt. This wasn't just about buildings or blueprints anymore. This was about erasure. And I, it seemed, was now officially on their list of things to be corrected. The silvery grid etched into my forearm became my unwilling compass. It ached whenever a significant correction was imminent, the lines seeming to grow a fraction more defined, a shade darker against my skin. This unsettling premonition, combined with the drone patterns I'd started to meticulously chart on my scavenged city maps, led me to them. I'd noticed a particular sector near the old jewelry district, a knot of narrow, intersecting alleyways and brick warehouses that resisted the full force of the dawn alterations. Changes occurred, but they were patchwork, incomplete, as if the rewriting signal struggled to penetrate the dense, chaotic urban fabric. Drones patrolled its periphery, but rarely ventured deep within. It was in the sub-basement of what used to be a silversmith's workshop, a space accessible only through a collapsed section of floor in a forgotten storeroom, that I found them. The air down there was thick with the scent of damp earth, mildew, and the acrid tang of solder. A single bare bulb, powered by a car battery jury-rigged to a small, sputtering generator, lit the room with a harsh, uneven glow. "Don't move!" a woman's voice said, sharp and steady. I froze. A figure detached itself from the deeper gloom, compact, wiry, with short dark hair plastered to her forehead. She held a length of rebar, its end sharpened to a wicked point. Her eyes, narrowed and intense, scanned me from head to toe. "Who are you? What do you want?" "My name is Alex Miller," I said, trying to keep my voice even. I've been seeing the changes too. I thought I was the only one." Another figure emerged, taller and older, his face a roadmap of wrinkles. "The changes, you say? Boy, you look like you've seen a ghost." He peered at me, his eyes surprisingly keen. Before I could elaborate, a third person, younger, with dark, intelligent eyes behind thick-rimmed glasses, stepped forward. He was fiddling with a device made of exposed circuit boards, wires, and what looked like an old radio antenna. "Olivia, Samuel, hold on," the younger man said, his voice quiet and thoughtful. "Look at his arm." He pointed to my left forearm, where the silvery grid was visible beneath my rolled-up sleeve. Olivia's eyes widened slightly. Samuel leaned closer. "I've seen marks like that," the man holding the strange device continued, his eyes analytical rather than hostile. "On material that's been partially overwritten. Fascinating. He didn't seem to register the personal horror of it. What frequency does it resonate with? Have you noticed any specific energy correlations?" Olivia lowered her rebar slightly. "XEMT, she said by way of introduction, her tone still wary. "Name's Olivia. That's Samuel, used to teach history at RIC. And the tinkerer here," she gestured with her chin towards the younger man, who gave a brief, almost shy nod, "is Ethan. He was some kind of engineer before. The hideout stretched through winding brick vaults and long-abandoned utility tunnels. Samuel explained that this part of the city, built over old waterways and with foundations sunk deep into centuries of landfill, possessed a structural complexity that confused the correction process. They'd fortified it further, reinforcing weak points, charting escape routes. It was damp, cold, but it felt real. The scent of old paper from Samuel's salvaged books and maps was a balm against the metallic tang that clung to everything outside. Ethan, it turned out, was a physicist, specializing in exotic materials and wave propagation. He had theories. "It's not a random overwrite," he explained one evening, sketching on a dusty slate with a piece of chalk. He drew 2 overlapping circles. "It's a bleed-through, a dimensional superimposition. Their world, the machine world, is trying to assert dominance, to pave over ours. The gravity shifts. Those are stress points, dimensional friction, like 2 tectonic plates grinding against each other." He tapped my arm mark. "And this? You were caught in a high-energy phasing event. Your biological matter partially resonated with their inorganic signal. You're lucky it wasn't a full conversion." He believed the machine saw organic life as a form of chaotic data, a contaminant in their perfectly ordered system. "Look at their sanitation protocols," he'd say, pointing to my notes on the public announcements. "It's pest control on a cosmic scale. They're not just building, they're sterilizing." His instruments, arrays of scavenged electronics and crudely wound copper coils, detected energy fluctuations preceding major corrections. These became our early warning system. Our first acts of defiance were small, focused on survival. Using Ethan's predictions, we'd evacuate small pockets of the old world just before a correction wave hit, salvaging what little we could: a box of medical supplies from a pharmacy about to be transmuted, a few precious gallons of clean water. Samuel's encyclopedic knowledge of Providence's original layout, combined with my own archival maps, allowed us to navigate the increasingly alien city through alleyways and basements, finding seams where the old world held precariously. Ethan even devised a crude electromagnetic pulse device from a microwave's magnetron and a car battery. It was bulky and took forever to charge, but a precisely timed burst could temporarily scramble the sensors of the smaller drones, giving us a few precious minutes to scavenge or slip past unnoticed. The discharge felt like a violent sneeze in the air, a prickle of static across the skin, and a brief, rainbow-hued visual distortion. The machine world, however, was not static. It learned. Drone patrols became more frequent, their flight paths less predictable. We started seeing new types: smaller, faster scouts that zipped through narrow passages, and heavily armored variants that seemed impervious to Ethan's EM pulse. Then came the new correction types. One dawn, an acoustic purge swept through our district. It wasn't merely loud, it was a barrage of ultra-low and ultra-high frequencies that bypassed the ears and seemed to vibrate directly within our skulls. The world swam in a nauseating wave of disorientation, our thoughts scattering like panicked birds. We barely made it back to the sub-basement, heads splitting. Another time, optical scramblers were deployed. Looking at old-world buildings through the open doorway of our hideout, their facades would writhe and distort, angles bending, surfaces crawling with illusory patterns that induced vertigo and a profound sense of unreality. But the worst came during a scouting mission into a recently corrected residential area. We were looking for any sign of other survivors, any pockets of resistance. Tucked away in what had once been a small playground, we found it. At first, I thought it was a new type of machine, some grotesque failed construction. But as we crept closer, the truth, far more horrifying, became clear. It was, or had been, human. The figure was fused, half submerged, into a newly materialized plinth of dark metal. One arm was oddly lengthened, segmented, ending in metallic claws. Patches of skin were overlaid with silvery plate-like growths, similar to my own mark but far more extensive, like a hideous, invasive armor. The face was contorted, jaw unhinged, and from its throat came a choked, continuous sound, a wet, rasping gurgle mixed with bursts of high-frequency clicks and screeches, like a broken modem trying to scream. One eye, wide and staring, was still recognizably human, filled with an unimaginable terror. The other was a glowing red optical sensor. Olivia, the pragmatic ex-EMT who'd seen her share of horrors, actually retched, turning away. Samuel muttered a prayer, his face ashen. Ethan, though visibly shaken, moved closer, his instruments whirring. "Incomplete assimilation," he whispered. "They tried to integrate it, but the organic structure resisted too much. The neural pathways are scrambled." The sight of that poor soul, trapped in a living hell between two worlds, haunted me. It was a visceral confirmation. Organic containment pending wasn't just a label, it was a process, and a horrifyingly imperfect one. My own arm throbbed sympathetically, the grid feeling alien against my skin. Despite the growing dread, we found small ways to fight back, to preserve slivers of our dying world. There was a tiny walled courtyard garden behind a derelict library, somehow missed by the corrections. Samuel had a particular fondness for its stubborn rose bushes. Ethan, using a complex array of salvaged copper wiring and specifically tuned capacitors, managed to create a localized interference field around it, a bubble of chaotic energy that deflected the rewriting signal. The roses, for now, were safe. It was a tiny victory, a fragile bloom of defiance in a world rapidly turning to indifferent metal. But our small successes were overshadowed. Ethan's instruments, monitored with increasing anxiety, began to show a new, ominous pattern. Energy readings across our entire district were climbing steadily, far exceeding anything we'd seen before. Drone activity on the periphery intensified, not just patrols, but larger, more heavily equipped units massing in the corrected zones. One evening, after a day spent reinforcing the entrance to our sub-basement, Ethan gathered us around his workbench. His face was grim, the usual spark of intellectual curiosity in his eyes dulled by exhaustion and something akin to fear. He pointed to a hand-drawn graph, its upward curve alarmingly steep. "The energy signatures are unprecedented," he said, his quiet voice barely audible above the distant, rhythmic clanging of the machine world. "The drone formations, the type of units massing, all indicators point to a large-scale protocol, not just a correction, a full sterilization event. They're preparing to overwrite this entire sector, systematically, and it's coming soon." Our small, damp sanctuary, our last bastion of the old world, was directly in the path of the storm. The fragile hope we'd nurtured felt like a flickering candle about to be snuffed out by an iron wind. Dawn arrived not with light, but with a sound, a discordant symphony of tearing realities. It began as a deep, subterranean groan, the bedrock of Providence itself protesting. Then came the shattering, like 1,000 stained glass windows imploding simultaneously as the molecular bonds of structures were ripped apart. This was no subtle overwrite. This was a demolition and reconstruction happening in the same horrifying breath. From the narrow, grime-caked window of our sub-basement, we watched the cityscape outside our fortified alleyway dissolve into a maelstrom of unmaking. A brick tenement across the way melted, its form flowing like hot wax before being violently recast into a towering, obsidian-black pylon that scraped the bruised sky. The air thrummed with a ferocious energy, thick with the smell of pulverized stone, flash-vaporized metals, and an underlying, deeply alien scent like burning circuits and crushed ice. "They're here," Olivia breathed, her hand gripping the sharpened rebar so tightly her knuckles were white. Ethan, pale but focused, adjusted the dials on a newer, more complex version of his energy detector, its needles spasming wildly. "The wavefront is accelerating, far faster than anticipated." The ground beneath us bucked, throwing us against the damp brick walls. Dust rained from the ceiling, the single bare bulb swinging crazily. The rhythmic clanking that had become the city's monstrous heartbeat was now drowned out by a new chorus. The heavy, synchronized stomping of colossal machinery, the high-pitched whine of advanced weaponry charging, and a pervasive multi-layered thrum that bypassed our ears and clawed directly at our brains. "We have to move!" I yelled over the din, my own voice sounding thin and reedy. "The north tunnel, Samuel. Is it still clear?" Samuel nodded. "It should lead us towards the old canal paths, less direct overwrite activity there historically. But we need to hurry." Our escape was a stumbling flight through the bowels of the city. The tunnel, an old Victorian-era storm drain, was slick with fetid water and echoed with the sounds of the cataclysm above. Twice, sections of the tunnel roof groaned and sagged, showering us with loose brick and crumbling concrete as the street level above was violently reconfigured. Heavy metallic impacts resonated through the earth, each one a punctuation mark in the city's death sentence. We emerged, gasping, into a narrow gully that once ran alongside a canal. The sky above was a tableau of roiling, unnatural clouds lit from within by flashes of actinic blue and searing orange, the discharge of machine weaponry. Towering over what used to be the jewelry district, now a landscape of stark, geometric monoliths and glowing conduits, were the new units. Spider-like walkers, dozens of feet tall, stalked on articulated legs, their turret-mounted cannons swiveling, occasionally loosing blasts of incandescent energy that turned old brick and steel into drifting ash. Smaller ground units resembling immense predatory insects forged from obsidian glided through the ruins, their movements eerily silent save for the hiss of their motive systems. One of them vaporized a surviving oak tree with a beam of concentrated sapphire blue light, leaving behind only a circle of super-chilled, brittle earth. We were trying to cross a wide, rubble-strewn plaza, once a bustling marketplace when disaster struck. A section of a nearby corrected tower, its alien geometry inherently unstable in our world's physics, suddenly fractured. A colossal slab of the dark, unidentifiable metal, easily weighing tons, sheared off and plunged towards us. I dove, Ethan practically falling over me. We rolled behind a mound of shattered concrete, the ground shaking violently as the slab hit with a sound like the gates of hell slamming shut. Dust and fragments rained down. When I could see again, coughing, my ears ringing, Olivia was already up, looking around frantically. "Samuel! Samuel!" He was lying near the edge of the impact crater, half buried under shattered concrete. One of his legs was bent. A dark stain was spreading on the grimy fabric of his trousers. "The archive!" he gasped, his voice weak as Olivia and I reached him. He clutched a battered leather satchel to his chest. "My notes, the original city charters." Ethan knelt, his face etched with despair. "Internal bleeding, multiple fractures. We can't move him far." Olivia, her EMT training kicking in despite the pallor of her face, tried to assess the damage, her touch surprisingly gentle. "We need to stop the bleeding, get him somewhere safe." But there was no safe place. Even as she spoke, one of the insect-like ground units changed direction, its crimson optical sensors fixing on our position. Samuel coughed, a fleck of blood on his lips. He looked at me, his eyes surprisingly clear. "There's an old access tunnel. Under the Hopkins Library Foundation, not on their maps. I marked it. In the satchel. It's tight, collapsing, but it might buy you time." He pushed the satchel towards me. "Go. Don't let them erase everything." "We're not leaving you," I protested. He fixed his eyes on me, unmoving. "Alex, you have to. Someone needs to remember what this place was." He fumbled inside his coat, pulling out a small, tarnished silver whistle. "A piece of Providence history," he said, a sad smile on his lips. He put it to his lips. The insect-like machine was gliding closer, its weapon array beginning to glow. "Olivia, Ethan, grab the satchel," I said, making the hardest decision of my life. Olivia hesitated, her face a knot of anguish, then nodded curtly, grabbing Ethan's arm and pulling him towards the direction Samuel had indicated. I took one last look at the old historian. He gave a weak nod, then blew a surprisingly loud, shrill blast on the whistle, the sound cutting through the chaos for a brief moment. It was a sound of pure, defiant humanity. The machine paused, its sensors focusing on the source of the unexpected noise. I didn't wait. I turned and ran, the sound of Samuel's whistle swallowed by the sudden, deafening discharge of the machine's weapon. Guided by Samuel's hastily scrawled map, its paper smudged with his blood, we found the tunnel entrance, a narrow hole, half hidden behind a collapsed wall of what was once a grand library. The air inside was cold, tasting of ancient dust and utter stillness. Ethan's instruments, which had been screeching, suddenly quieted, their needles dropping to near zero. My arm mark, which had been a constant, agonizing throb, eased to a dull ache. We followed the cramped passage, sometimes on hands and knees. It twisted and turned, the brickwork groaning under the immense pressure of the reshaped city above. Then, the tunnel opened into a vast, subterranean cavern. It was a structure of breathtaking scale and alien beauty, a crystalline heart beating with a strange energy at the center of a colossal, newly excavated chamber. It wasn't built. It looked like it had grown, its facets forming perfect, gleaming 120-degree angles that converged into a central, multifaceted spire, radiating an inner light. shifting through hues of violet, electric blue, and a white so pure it seemed almost unreal. The air around it was visibly distorted, like heat haze over asphalt, and the gravitational pull was strange. Small pebbles dislodged by my boots rolled uphill towards the structure. Countless conduits, thick as ancient tree trunks, snaked from its base, burrowing into the earth in all directions, glowing with the same internal light. Heavily armed drones, larger and more complex than any I'd seen before, patrolled its perimeter in slow, precise orbits. "My God," Ethan whispered, his voice filled with terror and awe. His instruments were alive again, their needles pinned to the maximum. "The energy output, it's off the scale. This must be the anchor point, the primary node for the entire correction process in this region." I pulled out one of Samuel's maps from the blood-stained satchel. The location of the Nexus corresponded with what was once a major convergence of underground rivers and, according to some obscure colonial-era geological surveys, a deep fault line. The machines hadn't just picked a random spot. They'd tapped into something fundamental. The sheer, overwhelming presence of the Nexus, its alien indifference, its monumental power, was crushing. Olivia stared at it. "We can't fight that. We need to get out of the city, find somewhere they haven't reached." But Ethan was already shaking his head, his eyes fixed on the central spire. "No. Look." He pointed to a rhythmic dimming and brightening in the Nexus's core luminescence, a subtle undulation in the thrumming it emitted. "It has a cycle, a recalibration maybe, or a data intake-output phase. There's a fractional drop in its energy shield cohesion every 93 seconds. He looked at me, a wild, desperate light in his eyes. "If we could introduce a sufficiently chaotic data stream during that dip, we might be able to disrupt its core programming, at least temporarily." "Disrupt it? Ethan, that thing could swat us like flies," Olivia protested. "We have to try," I said. Fleeing felt like a betrayal of Samuel, of everything we'd lost. As we debated, I noticed a damaged drone lying near the edge of the cavern, half crushed by fallen rock, one of its optical sensors cracked. It was smaller, a scout model. Cautiously I approached it. It was inert. Ethan joined me, his earlier despair replaced by a feverish curiosity. He managed to pry open a maintenance panel, revealing a tangle of crystalline circuitry and fiber optics. "Its data core seems partially intact," he murmured, carefully extracting a small, multifaceted crystal. He worked for an agonizing hour with a portable reader jury-rigged from his instruments and parts of my old, now useless smartphone. Finally, he looked up. Fragmented, mostly corrupted, but there are readable strings. "Prime Directive, impose order, eradicate Chaos Variant 7.3, organic substrate, standard stuff. But then this..." He pointed to a string of alien glyphs followed by a crude, machine-rendered translation. "Synchronization conflict imminent, energy reserves at critical threshold." The merge wasn't seamless for them either. It was costing them. They weren't omnipotent. Ethan's eyes met mine. "It's a gamble, a suicidal one, probably. But that fluctuation, it's a vulnerability. If we can exploit it..." We stood in the vast chamber, the monstrous heart of the machine world thrumming before us, Samuel's sacrifice a fresh wound in our souls. The choice was stark, certain slow erasure, or a desperate, almost certainly fatal, assault on the impossible. The approach to the Nexus core was a descent into an alien cathedral, one built on principles of geometry that felt inherently wrong to human eyes. Walkways of some dark, self-illuminated crystal cantilevered out over abysses that swallowed light, their angles too acute, their surfaces strangely slick, yet offering perfect traction. The air was cold, not a natural chill but a profound absence of heat, and carried a sharp scent like that of shattered quartz and starless voids. The resonant frequencies emanating from the core became stronger, making my arm burn. Ethan had fashioned our gift for the machine intelligence, a small, ruggedized casing containing a high-density data chip crammed with everything he could think of that represented chaotic, organic illogic. Poetry, music, philosophical paradoxes, historical accounts of human folly and passion, even raw emotional data extracted from his own neural scans during moments of fear and hope. His theory was that a sufficiently concentrated burst of such irrationality injected during the Nexus's brief recalibration cycle, might induce a systemic error, a cascade failure in its rigid, ordered processing. "The primary conduits," Ethan whispered, his voice tight against the overwhelming soundscape, pointing to massive crystalline arteries converging on the central spire. "We need to reach the primary input node. It should be near the base of the spire." Our first true obstacle manifested as distortions in the air ahead, like heat haze but cold to the touch. From these distortions, entities coalesced. Not solid mechanical guardians, but beings of pure coruscating energy, humanoid but with too many limbs that shifted and reformed. They moved with a fluid grace, unconstrained by the localized gravitational eddies that tugged at us. Their attacks were not projectiles, but waves of focused sonic force that struck like invisible hammers, or beams of disruptive energy that didn't burn, but unraveled matter at a molecular level, causing small sections of the crystalline walkway to simply cease to exist. Olivia met them head-on. She'd scavenged a length of the dark metallic conduit, heavy but incredibly strong, and wielded it like a quarterstaff. "Alex, Ethan, go. I'll buy you time," she said, her voice barely audible over the shrieking energies. She moved with a desperate ferocity, deflecting what she could, buying us precious seconds. The sight of her, a tiny, defiant human figure against those incandescent horrors, burned itself into my memory. We pressed on, the sounds of Olivia's battle fading behind us, replaced by the intensifying thrum of the Nexus core. We reached the base of the central spire, a vast, circular chamber where the air seemed to be made of solidified light and flowing geometric patterns. At its heart, suspended in a web of energy conduits, was what could only be the core interface. Not a console or a machine, but a perfect obsidian sphere about 10 feet in diameter. It absorbed all light, yet within its depths, galaxies of infinitesimal data points swirled and coalesced. "The cycle! It's about to dip!" Ethan gasped, his eyes glued to his reader. "Alex, the device. Get ready." He fumbled with a small, powerful magnetic clamp, intending to attach his package of chaotic data directly to one of the conduits feeding the sphere. But as he moved in to attach it, a previously unseen defense activated. A ripple of force, invisible but tangible, erupted from the sphere, slamming Ethan against the far wall. He crumpled, his device skittering across the floor. I scrambled towards him, but another pulse threw me back. He was conscious, barely, one arm clearly broken. "The device, Alex," he choked out. "You have to... timing. Perfect." The sphere began to dim, the resonant frequencies shifting to a lower, deeper key. The 93-second window. I grabbed Ethan's device. The magnetic clamp was damaged. There was no time to fix it, no way to attach it. The sphere was beginning to brighten again. Desperation flooded me. I looked at the core, then at the device in my hand, then at my own left arm, the silvery grid now blazing with an almost painful internal light, resonating fiercely with the Nexus. An insane idea sparked. My body was already partially attuned. "Forgive me, Ethan," I muttered. Clutching the device, I rushed forward, anticipating the next energy pulse, riding its edge like a surfer. As the core reached its dimmest point, I didn't try to attach the device. I slammed my marked forearm, the one with the spreading biometallic tracery, directly against the largest energy conduit leading into the obsidian sphere. The world exploded, not in fire and sound, but in pure, unfiltered sensation. It wasn't pain, it was too vast, too complex for pain. My consciousness was ripped from my body, sucked into the sphere, into the machine mind. I saw everything. The city, not as buildings and streets, but as a colossal, intricate manifold of data points, energy flows, probability matrices. I saw our world, organic, chaotic, vibrant, a screaming riot of entropy. I saw their world, cold, perfect, a silent symphony of absolute order. And I felt the prime directive not as words, but as an unshakable, existential imperative. Impose order. The chaotic data from Ethan's device, amplified, channeled through my own being, flooded into that ordered matrix. My memories, Samuel's sacrifice, Olivia's defiance, the scent of old books, the taste of fear, the sting of loss, the stubborn, irrational human will to be, crashed against the pristine logic of the machine. It was like pouring molten iron into a glacier. The sphere fractured, not physically, but its internal light shattered into a billion warring fragments. The resonant thrum of the Nexus became a screeching, tearing dissonance. The entire chamber convulsed. My arm felt like it was being simultaneously ripped apart and rebuilt at a molecular level. The silvery grid spread, racing up my shoulder, down my side, tiny, incandescent filaments of metal weaving themselves into my flesh, my nerves, my very bones. I awoke to chaos. The overwhelming presence of the Nexus was gone, replaced by a clash of conflicting energies. Ethan was beside me, propping me up, his face smeared with grime, but his eyes held a dazed, incredulous light. "You did it, Alex," he breathed. "The overwrite. It's stopped. It's broken." We stumbled out of the ruined Nexus chamber, back through the collapsed tunnels, emerging into a world transformed beyond recognition. Providence was no longer being methodically rewritten. It was now a fractured, unpredictable mosaic, a city caught in a permanent, violent state of flux. One street would be cobblestone and gaslight for half its length, then abruptly transition into gleaming, angular machine architecture, complete with glowing glyphs that shifted and reformed. A Victorian brownstone might have one wall made of solid dark metal, while its neighbour sported windows that looked out onto alien landscapes. Gravity was a local phenomenon. Pockets of our familiar pull existing next to zones where it was lighter or heavier, or even, in one terrifying instance, sideways. Patches of the old world, a park, a row of shops, a single defiant oak tree, would suddenly reassert themselves, pushing through the metallic overlay, only to be partially reclaimed by machine structures moments later. The corrections hadn't ceased. They had become erratic, localized, battling for dominance with the returning fragments of our reality. The sky was a maelstrom of swirling colors, where sections of blue, cloud-flecked Earth sky warred with the cold, star-dusted void of the machine world. Machine units still existed, but they were disorganized, their patrols haphazard, some seemingly frozen in place, others attacking random structures, both human and machine, as if their core programming had been fundamentally corrupted. My transformation was more than skin deep. The biometallic tracery now covered most of my left arm and snaked across my torso, an intricate pattern that felt like a part of me, warm and alive. But it was more than that. I could feel the shifts before they happened, a prickling intuition, a sympathetic resonance with the unstable currents of the merging realities. I could sense the seams, the weak points, the flow of the chaotic energies. I was no longer purely human, I was something else, a bridge perhaps between two warring existences. We found other survivors, not many. Small, terrified groups huddled in the pockets of relatively stable old-world reality. They looked at my arm, at the way I navigated the treacherous, shifting landscape, with a mixture of fear and dawning hope. Olivia was gone. We searched, but the area where she'd made her stand was an unrecognizable ruin of fused crystal and shattered earth. Her name became a prayer, a symbol of the price paid. I lost track of where one day ended and the next began. Time gathered itself in uncertain intervals, shaped only by the struggle to adapt. There was no victory, no peace, just a new terrifying normal, survival in the flux. I stood on what remained of a rooftop overlooking the fractured cityscape of Providence. Below, a street rippled, cobblestones warring with metallic plates, a 19th century gas lamppost flickering beside a column that glowed with alien script. The building beneath my feet gave a disconcerting lurch as a localized gravity field shifted. I touched the intricate, warm tracery on my arm. It resonated with a distant thrum that I now recognized as the crippled heartbeat of the machine world, a rhythm strangely, terrifyingly echoed in my own pulse. A small group of survivors watched me from the doorway leading onto the roof. They looked to me, their new, unwilling and profoundly altered guide. Dawn was breaking, not with a clean, singular correction, but with a fresh, unpredictable wave of transformations rippling across the city. A nearby skyscraper, half human, half machine, began to grow crystalline spines, while a park 2 blocks over suddenly sprouted trees with bark like burnished copper. "It's not over," I said, feeling the shift in the air, the premonition of the next reality spasm. I turned to face them, to face this new day. It's just different. And we're still here. The struggle hadn't ended. It had merely changed its form, becoming a fractured, ongoing synthesis. And I, a reluctant hybrid, was a part of its unstable, terrifying heart. The future was a maelstrom, but in its chaos there was a grim, savage kind of hope. The hope of adaptation, of endurance, of becoming something new in a world that had irrevocably broken all the old rules.